So as the intern minister here, one of the things I'm learning this year is what it's like to live as a minister outside of the congregation, just going about my daily life. And I had gotten a sense of it in New York before I moved here, what it's like to show up to parties or whatever it is that I do for fun and tell people that I'm a minister. It's a strange thing. I found in San Francisco, though, that people are not so put off or curious about me being a minister. They're just confused and startled that I don't work in tech. Sounds like some of you have had that experience, or are maybe here hoping to make some friends who don't work in tech. I'm not sure. But so that was my experience yesterday when I gathered with some friends from high school, one of whom is here now, someone I've actually known since second grade. And most of the people gathered worked in tech, and they were talking about Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes. This isn't a story that I know, but I see some of your heads shaking, or I did know before. I see some of your heads nodding, so it's a story that probably some of you are familiar with. Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos was, for a brief moment, a few sweet years, the darling of Silicon Valley, a biotech company run by a woman in an industry that, despite having some women, despite having some people of color, some people of the global majority, is more or less dominated at the very top levels of power by white men. So Elizabeth Holmes, a woman rising to the top, a unicorn in both the technical sense of someone who was about to make a whole lot of money, $9 billion, and an unusual person, a woman, was someone celebrated, lifted up for her success. She took a lot out of Steve Jobs' playbook, including a signature black turtleneck and a way of running a company, running an organization, of gathering people to her leadership that in lots of ways mimicked the leadership of other men in the industry, ways that kept people in siloed informational channels, ways that kept people competitive and committed to a mission of an organization that didn't allow for them to truly collaborate, but instead made all the decision-making something that came directly to her. Now, in the last few years, Elizabeth Holmes has fallen from grace, fallen from this exalted position because of a scandal. It turns out that the company was largely a fraud, and while she had people going for a while, it didn't last forever. Now, Elizabeth Holmes didn't ruin Women's History Month. Just like Jussie Smollett, a black gay man, didn't ruin Black History Month. The pressure on women and on ethnic and racial minorities is immense to represent their entire group. But Elizabeth Holmes didn't ruin Women's History Month. Jussie Smollett didn't ruin Black History Month, any more so than Andrew Jackson ruined the American presidency because of his racist policies. He didn't do it all alone. And on that front, he's getting lots of help, actually. But if Elizabeth Holmes, in both her failure, the failure of the company, as well as her success, the model of leadership that she brought forward, is not the feminist hero that we need for this month, I want to offer an alternative. I want to introduce you to a historical figure that I suspect many of you may not know, but whose face adorns one of the devotional candles that I have on my home altar. An ancestor who I'm not linked with by blood, but someone whose example and orientation towards history is someone that I routinely ground myself with when I'm feeling a need to draw courage and passion. How many of you have heard of the Reverend Dr. Pauli Murray? A handful, 2, 3, maybe. Oh no, that was a fake out. Okay. It's unfortunate, but not surprising. It's appalling, but not accidental that we don't know, for the most part, the Reverend Dr. Polly. She was, for a brief time, the assistant deputy, or rather the deputy attorney general of this state, the first African American to hold that position. She earned a law degree from Berkeley. But her marginalized identities, the intersection of a number of different identities, renders her an inconvenient character for our more traditional historical narratives. The beginning of her story, though, it sounds familiar. It fits into our hero myths. Polly Murray was an orphan. She was raised by an aunt in North Carolina. She was raised in a mixed-race family that gathered in a wide variety of spiritual communities. She wrote in her memoir later that when the whole family got together, it was like the United Nations in miniature. She learned to read before starting school, and by the time she graduated at age 15, she was the editor-in-chief of the school newspaper, the president of the Literary Society, class secretary, a member of the debate club, the top student, and a forward on the basketball team. Now, she grew up in the South in the early part of the 20th century, and at a very young age, she found herself routinely infuriated by the segregation and racial discrimination of Jim Crow. So she resolved to come north. She moved to New York at age 15, intending to enroll at Columbia. She was horrified upon arriving to learn that Columbia didn't accept women. It's one instance among many in her life that she learned that the contours of her life, if she left it to the traditions and stunted moral imaginations of others, it would be kept small on account of not only her race and her gender, but certainly those. So she went to Hunter instead. After a few years and earning her bachelor's degree, she went back to North Carolina to enroll in what she hoped would be a graduate program in sociology at the University of North Carolina. At the time, the University of North Carolina didn't admit black people, and there was another college that she could have attended, but didn't have a graduate program in sociology. Now, Plessy versus Ferguson, the idea that separate but equal was an acceptable educational and social arrangement meant that funding of an alternative program would be required. In order to block this, the state of North Carolina simply had its state legislature not meet for 2 years. So annoying was her request. She knew that when she applied, but she also knew her own history. She knew that she was the descendant not only of black people, enslaved people, but also slave owners. She knew that she had had multiple relatives attend the school, multiple relatives serve on the board of trustees, and another had created and endowed a permanent scholarship. Surely, she reasoned in her application, she had a right to be among them. The response was clear. Dear Miss Murray, I write to state that members of your race are not admitted to the university. That letter, 2 days after she received it, it made her briefly famous. The NAACP was interested in finding somebody that they would that would allow them to sue the state, but she was a New York resident, and that made her a less than ideal plaintiff. But there were other reasons why her at the heart of a lawsuit were less than ideal. A few years later, on a southbound bus from New York to Virginia, she was arrested. 15 years before Rosa Parks sat down on a bus and triggered the Montgomery bus boycott, Polly Murray and a friend also refused to change seats. They refused and were arrested. The NAACP was interested in pursuing the case, but again, she was a less than ideal plaintiff. Polly Murray, when she was arrested, was wearing the clothes of a man, wearing trousers and traveling with a woman that was probably her lover. The NAACP didn't pursue that case, didn't think it was something that she could win. Still, she had powerful friends. Pauli Murray was friends with Eleanor Roosevelt for many decades. They became friends when, enraged, Pauli Murray wrote to FDR, wrote to Eleanor's husband, and said, "It really seems like you care an awful lot more about fascism abroad than white supremacy at home. Do you think maybe we could pay attention to two things at once?" FDR couldn't be bothered to respond to the letter, but he did share it with Eleanor, who wrote back and invited Pauli to tea. They became lifelong friends and worked in advocacy together. So after the unsuccessful attempt to go to school for sociology, Murray thought, well, she might as well become a lawyer. She enrolled at Howard, and for the first time in her life, race ceased to be an issue. In the company of other African Americans, race was no longer something that limited her interactions in the classrooms. But certainly her gender did. She was the only woman among the students, as well as the professors. And routinely, she was found that to be inconsequential, insignificant by her classmates. Traditionally, the president of the class was the person who got the top marks. After the first semester, when it became clear that she was the one who would be in that role, the student body decided that they maybe just didn't need a president. You can see that this is a pattern in Pauli Murray's life. Before she left, they realized that she was so extraordinary that they corrected her mistakes. But she put up with an awful lot while she was there. While discussing how to dismantle Plessy versus Ferguson, how to dismantle this doctrine of separate but equal, she raised her hand and introduced that perhaps it was not the equal part that would be the downfall of that legal argument, but the separate part. Her classmates laughed, as did the professor, but she made a bet with her professor, a man named Spotswood Robinson. Within 25 years, Plessy versus Ferguson would be overturned, she said. She bet him $10. She was right, and her professor, Robinson, using her final thesis with this legal argument, was one of the people who helped dismantle this in Brown versus Board of Education. She was right, though I'm not sure she ever got her $10 or her $66.30, as would be the ratio that black women are paid in reference to white men now in 2019. She never got it, but she was right. And that's, again, one of the patterns of Pauli Murray's life. After graduating from Howard, she applied to Harvard, who wanted to accept her, except that their letter stated, "You're not of the sex entitled to be admitted to Harvard Law School." Murray wrote back, "Gentlemen, I would gladly change my sex to meet your requirements, but since the way that such change has not yet been revealed to me, I have no recourse but to appeal to you to change your minds on this subject. Are you to tell me that one is as difficult as the other?" It was a witty response, but one that also spoke deeply to Murray's personal experience. After a brief marriage while she was in New York to a man, it became clear to her that her romantic and sexual desires were for women. She would be partnered with women for the rest of her life. But it wasn't simply a matter of sexual orientation that makes her an unusual, or, let's be really clear, a deliberately erased character in our shared history, but also her gender identity. While she was in New York, like everything else, she, with enthusiasm and abandon, sought to better understand herself. She used the word homosexual to refer to other people, but never used it to refer to herself, because as far as she could tell, she was a man trapped in a woman's body. She used she pronouns, but she was clear that she must have the sex organs of a man buried deep inside her, or at least a hormonal imbalance that made her more masculine than she might otherwise have expected. Her aunt, who raised her, lovingly called her her little boy girl, and that was something that, though we might take offense to that terminology now, Polly always found deeply affirming, as if she were seen by someone who truly knew her. Because she was dogged, she first found an endocrinologist to test her hormone levels and found that, in fact, she did not have more testosterone than any other woman. In fact, she had slightly less. And later on in her life, when surgery was called for otherwise, she asked the doctor if they could just root around and see if they could find any masculine or male anatomy. They came up empty-handed. Later in her life, after these attempts to discover her inner male would prove fruitless, she saw herself largely at this middle place, not quite a man, not quite a woman. So when she wrote to Harvard saying, "I would gladly change my sex," it wasn't just so that she could claim the opportunities due to her, but also because that perhaps spoke to a deeper sense of self. But either way, Harvard didn't take her, so she came out to Berkeley and was the deputy attorney general for a while, before returning to New York, before a brief time in Ghana, and then returning again to New York. She floated in and out for most of her career through short-term legal appointments. Short-term not because she lacked the skill, but because often the institutions that would find space for her could not find enough space to hold her talent and expertise. On the side, she did incredible work with her friend Betty Friedan, who was at the time the most famous feminist in the country. They talked about how there needed to be something like an NAACP for women. In June of 1966, Murray and Friedan spoke in a hotel room, and they launched the National Organization for Women. Decades later, Murray would come to think that the National Organization for Women, which was meant to pursue the liberation of women in this country, had become an organization for white women, for professional women. And it, like so many things in her life, was ultimately found disappointing. But it didn't stop her important work. She wrote a legal brief that Ruth Bader Ginsburg later used to apply the 14th Amendment to women and equal protection of genders. This constant work, this ability to use legal language and social structures to dismantle patriarchy, to dismantle racism, to dismantle the ways in which society's limited moral imagination, was something that she pursued for decades, but was not the final chapter of her life. After the death of her longtime partner, Polly Murray turned to another career, seeking instead a place where she might be able to speak more freely the reality of racial and gender liberation. Seeking a place to rehearse and practice the beloved community, Polly Murray decided to become a minister. She left her tenured position at Brandeis in the American Studies department and entered seminary. Now, because Polly Murray was who Polly Murray was, she entered seminary and training to become an Episcopal priest. At the time, the Episcopal Church did not ordain women. Her timing was never very good, but in this case, it actually worked out pretty well for her. The Episcopal Church decided to change its policy, decided to ordain women, and that was going to become effective 3 weeks after she graduated from seminary. A few months after graduating, she was ordained as an Episcopal priest at the National Cathedral. For the last 7 or 8 years of her life, she found herself speaking not legal arguments, not ways to convince and demand that people see her as a capable and brilliant and fabulous person. She had done that work, and it was important work. She found at the end of her life she wanted a place where people would already believe that the moment she walked in. Now, whether she got that in the church or not, I don't know, but in her faith community, she thought maybe that was a place where possibility could most blossom. Decades before she did this, she wrote in her memoir, "If anyone should ask a Negro woman in America what had been her greatest achievement, her honest answer would be, 'I survived.'" At the end of her life, Murray decided that her mere survival would not be enough. Certainly she had done that, and what a great and fierce accomplishment it was. But for her liberation, for her journey towards freedom, she would continue to drive up against the inhumanity of social structures. She would ask us to renounce patriarchy so that she might be set free, but also so that the men around her might be set free. After a lifetime of working to excavate and alter the society that was dead set on oppressing her, Murray administered her first Eucharist, her first communion, at the Chapel of the Cross. It was a little church in North Carolina where 100 years prior, a priest had baptized her grandmother. Her grandmother was still a baby at the time. Her grandmother was still a slave at the time. Pauli Murray's life, the sweetness of her existence, softened the wounds of her ancestors. Our existence, the call to move into the story and spirit in which power can be confronted by other, more democratic, more universally held roles. That sweetness also softens the wounds of Pauli Murray's. I offer Pauli Murray to you as an example of what contemporary feminism might look like. I offer Pauli Murray to you as an example of what dismantling structures of power can oppress can look like. Pauli Murray was organized and brilliant, but most of all, what she did powerfully in the face of institutions and people who had no language or framework for her existence, and even less so, a desire to create them. What she did in the face of those was continue to not only assert her existence, but to demand that they expand their moral imaginations. This, too, is something offered to each of us. The stakes are very high. Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos, she proclaimed that she was offering something to the world that would save lives. That is ultimately what is at stake here. The lives of women and gender minorities when it comes to access to health care, to housing, to any number of ways in which our lives are shorter and less sweet, but also for men. I was reading an article in Vice magazine, which, not in spite of its name, but I think because of its name, is a particularly good chronicle of human behavior. And the magazine, or the article rather, talked about men attached to particularly rigid forms of masculinity live shorter lives. The causal relationship here was communication with their doctors. Men with particularly rigid and firm senses of their own manliness found that they were unable to express to their doctors what their symptoms and problems were, and therefore were less likely to get treatment. Now, I jumped to conclusions reading this article and assumed that in the contemporary world where doctors are sometimes women, these men in particular would feel constrained in speaking with women. That wasn't the case. What they found in this particular study was men with certain rigid forms of their own manliness, found that that masculinity was so fragile, so poisonous, that men were unwilling or unable to share their symptoms and problems with doctors who were male. They were unwilling to be vulnerable with other men. The stakes are very high. Patriarchies bind on our moral imaginations, cost lives. So not yet, but in a moment, we'll rise up to sing well and loudly a beautiful hymn that offers God in many forms. Not all the forms, as Mark and I hoped, but many forms. There's a strong mother God, a warm father God, an old aching God, a young growing God, and a great living God. Should we be tempted to see ourselves in these faces of the divine, and why wouldn't we really? I want to acknowledge that this hymn offers God within a gender binary that doesn't include everyone in this room, that doesn't ultimately include Polly Murray. For the non-binary among us, know that I have no doubt that you too carry a piece of the truth, that you too wear the face of the divine. But if we're planning to read ourselves into this hymn, let's all go with the fifth verse. The fifth verse, I think, speaks to all of us. It is my hope. Because no matter what you believe about the divine, regardless of whether or not God is a significant word for you, this preacher says to you, definitively, that in God years, we're all very young. So may each of us here, in our faithful living and in our feminism, be as the hymn proclaims, eager still to know, willing to be changed by what we started. May it be so. Amen.